Good morning, Stan Stahl here with Secure the Village. Welcome to our webinar. This month, we've got a very special guest, Bob Zukis, and we'll be talking about board responsibilities and board leadership. It's kind of taking the discussion from down in the trenches up to the very top of the organization. Want to just, first of all, a call out to our webinar this month is being sponsored by the Pepperdine Grazio Dio Business School and their CYRP program, Certified Risk Professional Certificate, and my company, Citadel Information Group. And just want to let everybody know, if you haven't signed up already, please sign up and register for our conference on October 17th, where we'll have Ron Ross, who's a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a real expert on risk and risk management in the cyber world. He's our keynote speaker. So please sign up for this, and definitely it's going to be the conference of the year. You're not going to want to miss this. So today we'll be talking about board responsibilities, board leadership with Bob. Bob's the CEO and founder of the Digital Directors Network. And Bob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Stan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Bob Zukis, spent most of my career as a PwC management consulting partner, lived and worked all over the world, founded DDN to really address the digital and cybersecurity leadership crisis that companies around the world are facing on these issues. I'm a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. Today is a class day. I'll be heading to campus after our webinar. Today I'm teaching a corporate governance class to MBAs. Today's our second class, so I'll be heading off as soon as we finish that. I've got a couple of strategic roles in the governance community. One is a senior fellow for the conference board and a member of their cyber advisory group. In New York City, I'm a board member for the NACD SoCal chapter, now the Pacific Southwest chapter, former Bloomfire CEO and director, and I advise VC, PE firms on these issues on digital disruption, the transformation opportunities, as well as the risks of technology. I write for Forbes. We've got one of my Forbes posts that will pop up here in a few slides, and I speak and I write on these issues fairly extensively.
Absolutely, yeah. It was through the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, that you and I met several years ago with this common interest in cybersecurity, and in your case as well, in the broader set of technology matters that, in some sense, you can't separate those two out. I will call out behind you. Everybody can notice you clearly are a Trojan, and you've also got a background in the University of Chicago. Clearly, my wall behind me needs more University of Michigan things on it, so that
I don't know if we're playing you this year, but yeah. Go Trojans if we are.
That's right, and go blue as well on that. Yeah, why don't you start? Give us a sense of DDN, what it is. You just alluded to why you started it, but there's some depth here. I mean, you and I've known each other several years, and you go really deep in this stuff, which I love. I think that's so important. So much of what's needed out there in the board community.
Yeah, and this is an issue that I've been passionate about for 6 years, and it was really a story of, as I was winding down my career of PwC. I retired in 2012. I was running our IT strategy and ops business, and we were getting calls from our corporate clients, from their boards, and they all wanted to talk about social media. Facebook was about to IPO. It was the top of the hype cycle back then. All you read about was social this, social that. So the corporate boards wanted to understand these issues. So I was getting the call to go into the room and talk to them. Despite a pretty amazing career over 30 years in 4 countries or 20 countries and 4 continents, I'd never really spent a lot of time in the boardroom. And when I got in there and I started to engage and talk to them about my views on social and what this was really about, was pretty surprised. And I think, I struggle with what the right emotion was, but I don't think it was actually surprise. I think it was actually disappointment. I was fairly disappointed that I didn't see more people like me on corporate boards. The nature of the conversations were very foundational, very basic, and I had expected corporate boards to have more representation from the digital leadership community as well as the cybersecurity leadership community. So I found that curious, and then through the conference board role, through the NACD role, I kept speaking to this event, to this issue, trying to understand the problem, if it was a problem, and then what happened over the last 6 years is the problem got pushed out there for everyone to see. The daily headlines around cybersecurity breaches, board members woke up to the issue. It obviously became a problem to many, many people. So my instincts were right in terms of boards and their ability to deal with these issues and to have the people in the boardroom that understood them. So finally got to a position where my network, my market was pushing me towards a solution. I was looking for the recruiters to solve the problem, other organizations to step up and solve the problem. Nobody really saw it or had the urgency to solve it in the way that I thought it needed to be solved. So DDN was really born of that necessity, and it's really the first professional association focused exclusively on these issues in the digital and cybersecurity leadership crisis we have in boards and leadership circles more broadly in the United States and globally. This is very much a global issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So talk a bit then just about, so what does DDN do? What are the pieces that you see as important here?
Yeah, I would describe it as communication, education, and advisory practice. So we're the first and only professional association focused on these issues. So we're pulling together a group of executives, CIOs, CISOs, CEOs, tech industry executives, corporate directors who see this as a problem in the way that we do. And that's still the early adopter part of the entire marketplace, but there is this latent desire to fix this problem, and others have seen it. So it's really a professional association focused on organizing a community around these issues and then developing a much more structured approach to solving this from an oversight perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you say as well about building community, we see that in the cyber world, not just at the board level, but throughout, and for SecureTheVillage in particular, in the greater LA, Southern California area, which is our geographic footprint as well. It's that same thing, that need to build community and then use that community as a way to reach out. And the second of the bullets to the left, education is critical. We find.
A quick point on the education piece as well, Stan. The USC is on board this issue as well. So we've created at USC the only 2-day exec ed program for digital and cybersecurity governance. We're the only B school in North America to have that program to teach corporate directors about these issues. So that partnership that I'm able to bring with USC Marshall adds an enormous amount of value. USC Marshall also does a big corporate director event with the NACD every year in November as well. So give a shout out to that. It says recruiting on that slide. We're actually not a typical recruiter, but what we do is we connect our membership to board opportunities. And we just made our first connection, and we had the chief risk officer for a major public company in New York take a board seat for one of our other member companies. So we're making the market, and we're not taking fees for that. We're more focused on solving the problem. So I don't want there to be friction in that process right now. So we're getting the right people on the boards to solve these problems, and we're teaching all leadership how to solve them.
Yeah, I find that's so valuable. I'm part of your network. You're part of our network, and it's this integration and all that. I mean, we've got a challenge that we both, as we've talked about several times. I mean, it's national, it's international, and it's one that, frankly, we have to solve it top to bottom. And I find the next slide is an interesting one as well, in what it says about the understanding of the board of what they've got to deal with.
And that's the data point that sums it all up. This is the worst thing that boards are about. This is the thing that they're worst at: understanding technology risks, understanding new technologies, the transformative impacts of new technologies, and the risks that go along with these technologies. By their own admission, this is their weak spot. So we're stepping in to solve that weak spot. And so they recognize that they have this problem. That recognition is growing. DDN's really stepping in to say, what do we do about it now? How do we fix it? So people have been woken up. Everybody sees the headlines. Everybody sees the numbers that companies are getting fined, but they don't know what to do about it yet. So this is part of the next step.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's a quote, I forget who it's from, some science fiction writer, to the effect that the future is already here, it's just not equally distributed.
Yeah, I love that, yeah.
Yeah, and this is in some sense what we're talking about. There's a recognition that there's a problem here that seems to be more and more distributed.
Yeah,
what we now do about it.
Yeah, and it's not a small problem. The World Economic Forum is called cybersecurity and existential. You know what I'm saying?
Existential, yes.
Yeah, there you go.
That's easy for you to say. Yeah.
Easy for me to say. Risk to our society, our existence as we know it. Warren Buffett's come out and said this is an existential risk as well. So when influential organizations recognize the scope of this problem at that magnitude, it helps, but still we're not taking enough steps to solve it that we need to be solving and at the pace that we need to be solving it.
Right, and I know one of the things you and I both talked about, it was also talked about in the last webinar that we had on risk, is that risk is not just the risk that bad things will happen, but there's opportunity. There's an opportunity side to risk as well. Maybe you want to say a few words about that piece of it.
That kind of doesn't get enough airtime to me, and I think that's the right way to look at it. Opportunity risk. So cybersecurity risk gets the headlines. That's the burning platform, but technology and how it drives business value, and we've got some data points on this that we'll share a little bit later into the webinar today. But what technology does to create, capture, and shape value for any organization is really the long-term opportunity, and that's a leadership issue, and leaders need to understand these issues, these opportunities, and they go down to some foundational economic impacts around these technologies. The exponential reduction of transaction costs makes markets much more efficient. That's in my opinion Amazon's secret sauce. They're just much better at making markets with technology than many firms are. And so leadership always gets very nervous when Amazon decides to enter their marketplace, and it's because they're exploiting these tools, and they're exploiting what the tools can do around some very basic economic drivers that are irrefutable, that are foundational to why companies succeed and grow the way that they do.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, when we think of security, cybersecurity in its traditional way, okay, so I've got second factor authentication, let's say on my bank account. Well, that just increased the friction, the login friction, if you will. It's one more step I have to go through. The idea that I have to change a password every 90 days, that's friction again in the system. And we tend to see cybersecurity as a friction causing challenge. Oh, why do we have to do this? And that's particularly the case, I think, with leadership who's often impatient and doesn't want things, to slow the process down. We once had a client, we were doing interviews of the leadership in this client's firm. It was a law firm. And this one partner said to me, this was before the days of face recognition on your iPhone and things like that. He says, when I'm on the freeway and I've got to call a client, I don't want to have to enter a password to be able to do that. I want it friction free. And there's that challenge that security often gets in the way of that.
Yeah. Although there are some places where you do want friction, where that trade-off between creating friction and reducing a risk profile, that ROI is still very beneficial. So you have to understand both sides of that equation. You just can't look at the added friction by embedded within a particular process. You have to understand what you're trying to achieve. Off that process.
Yeah, when we talk about those kinds of things, I think about business email compromise, and the employee who gets an email that says transfer $100,000 to this bank account. Well, you bloody well want some friction in that. Pick up the phone, call your boss, and say, "Did you really send this email?"
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
friction's good.
you know, there's some, then there's basic hygiene issues, right? And there's basic awareness issues that most companies can get much better on at all levels of the organization, not just the board and the
Mhm.
C-suite, but all levels of the organization. We used to do a lot of attack and penetration work at PwC and some companies here in LA. We'd go in and we'd always, you know, go through a phishing exercise as part of those projects, and a lot of times there were cyber projects and there were also physical security projects as well. But we'd usually get the CEO on the hook, or
Mhm.
other members of the executive team to respond to our exercise, and it's kind of amazing that, you know, this day and age, that you're still seeing people susceptible to these type of hacks, but the hacks are actually getting much better and much cleverer and harder to
Mhm.
detect. So it's changing the game, and you know, that's the nature of hacking, right? These people are very good at their job, very focused, and if you have a weakness, they'll find it and exploit
Oh
it.
yeah, yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Which is a good segue to the next slide, which is an article of yours. I remember when I saw this when it first came out, and it was on the Citadel Cybersecurity News of the Week. Of course, we put it in there. But I love the title. Uh, Facebook knows less about data privacy than Mr. Potato Head. Uh, yeah, go.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
story behind that title, other than who doesn't love Mr. Potato Head,
Uh,
and you know, I think anybody that writes at some point in their career, you have to, you know, put Mr. Potato Head into some of your writings in some way, shape, or form. But the story behind that is Hasbro actually has a data privacy committee on their corporate board. So what does Hasbro get about these issues that Facebook didn't? Why do they understand these issues at a leadership level, but Facebook didn't? And so Facebook, actually, they have cybersecurity risk oversight still embedded within their audit committee, which is
mhm,
probably the worst place you can put it. But that's kind of the generally accepted approach, or it's the general approach that most uninformed boards take. I think 52% is the number of the S&P 500 that just kind of slot that in with the audit committee along with
mhm,
everything else. It's kind of the kitchen sink theory. But yeah,
mhm,
when Facebook got slapped down by the FTC, I mean, a $5 billion fine, big number. Facebook's a big, hugely profitable company, so, you know, blip on the radar for them. But what they really forced Facebook to do is they forced them to put a data privacy committee onto their corporate board, and to put privacy executives within the organization, and then to do biennial audits of their privacy practices around the massive amounts of data that they control, manipulate, and have access
mhm.
to. So the regulatory intent is starting to take a very big hammer to these issues, and I think we're at the cusp of another Sarbanes-Oxley style piece of legislation that's going to force leadership and force corporate boards to address this in a much more effective way than they are right now, which they're really not in any
Mhm.
material way, shape, or form.
Yeah, yeah, and I see that. My poster child for this kind of, what when boards don't get it, if you will, is Equifax, of course, with their breach. And I remember shortly after the breach was announced, going to Equifax's uh, board website and looking for what can I find about the board's perspective on cybersecurity, and there was nothing there. It was
Yeah.
all about increasing shareholder value, selling our information. We're the product, of course, to their customers. Not a word about security, and it raises the question. I mean, we saw. I mean, what the breach at Equifax was the result of missing patches, and you can argue,
Yeah.
well, gee, isn't it IT's job to patch systems? And isn't it security's job to make sure that systems are being patched in an organized, regular way? And there was another one of their sites that was accessible over the internet with admin, I think, as the user ID and password. But you step back and it seems like the board ought to have the responsibility, whether it actually legally has or not, ought to have that responsibility of providing leadership. They're the, that's where the culture gets started, it would seem, at the board level.
Yeah, and to your point of are they legally obligated to oversee these issues? I think they are, and I think we're kind of at a borderline negligent period in
Hmm.
corporate governance. If you look at duty of care,
Hmm.
if you look at the legal responsibilities of corporate boards, it doesn't require them to be passive to these issues. It requires them to actually take proactive steps. And we've got there's a great lawyer who's on top of this issue who wrote an article on this on DDN, in terms of the board's responsibilities to these issues. So,
Hmm.
what will regulators hold boards accountable for their negligence on these issues at some point in time? I think we've seen some of that. I think Target's
Hmm.
board got sued for their response to this breach as well as the breach itself. Clearly, what the FTC is signaling is that the buck stops with the board on this issue. Get somebody in the room that understands these issues and take a much more structured approach to it. And
Hmm.
we actually have precedent for this. If you go back 17 years, and this is always gets a chuckle from people when I make this point. It was only 17 years ago when the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation came into play in 2002. So one of the things that legislation did is it forced corporate boards to put a qualified financial expert in the boardroom. So think about that. It was only 17 years ago when it was a novel concept to have somebody in the boardroom that understood a financial statement. So, and that had to be forced by regulators.
Hmm.
This is another domain where the risks, upside and downside, are material, are significant, are clearly in the public interest, and regulators are starting to bring hammers to this issue, just not with these kind of penalties, but also they've indicated a desire to throw criminal penalties at executives
Hmm.
around these issues on the back of the Marriott breach. Representative Wyden, his draft legislation for I think it was FTC, within the FTC, for a Data Privacy Protection Act would have brought criminal and civil penalties to the privacy officer, to the CEO on these issues. So the FTC's response to Facebook was actually kind of cut and pasted from what Wyden had drafted. So we're starting to see regulatory intent very clearly exhibited. We don't have the wide spanning regulation
Hmm.
that I think we will, but regulators have clearly shown their cards on this issue.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And again, to me, it's there's a duality here. On the one side, the regulatory piece of it, and on the other side, that given that regulatory uh, environment, if you will, around it, but then also beyond that, I mean, the words leadership strategy are right under your name on this slide, and it's always struck me that the board, they're the ones that have the opportunity to begin to impact the culture, to
Yeah.
change that culture, to make it more adaptive to to cybersecurity, have a cybersecure culture, if you will, where people understand. It's what we call in Secure the Village, turning people and organizations into cyber guardians, where
Yeah.
everybody knows it's just part of the culture. This is the way we do things here. So you don't have to think about it. It's just built into the culture that way.
Yeah, and it's digital and cybersecurity tone at the top. So if the
Yeah.
executives are paying attention to these issues, educating themselves around these issues, and setting that right tone at the top, the organization has to get better at it. And right now we've got a vacuum at the top of most organizations on these
Hmm.
issues.
Yeah. 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 Let's move on to the next slide here, which again, this brings cybersecurity and technology up to the forefront. This is a chart you put together this from Ernst & Young, their CEO imperative study, 5 key global challenges that threaten business growth over the next 5 to 10 years. And you can see security and technology are up there at the top.
Yeah, it goes back to Buffett and the existential risk comment. So these are foundational business issues. So these need to be discussed and given airtime at the leadership levels of the organization. We don't have a demographic in the corporate board that kind of grew up with technology as a value driver.
Hmm.
Technology was kind of a back office function, and you'd get the tech guy in when you couldn't log in, you couldn't get access to
Right.
through your VPN.
Yeah.
You couldn't log onto your computer. You had some issue taking place, and that 63-year-old average demographic for male, 63-year-old male, average white male in most corporate boards didn't grow up with technology as a creator of the next revenue dollar. The technology, every technology decision that you make has a cybersecurity risk profile attached to it. So these conversations have to go hand in hand. And the technology is really just a tool. And business over the last century has always adopted, adapted, and taken new tools and figured out new ways to create new sources of value in the marketplace with those new tools. This is no different. The complexities are much different, and we don't have the people that really grew up understanding the nature of these tools. But we can change that, and that's what we're working towards doing. Yeah. So foundational business issues that are a growth conversation. So what's more important in the boardroom than that discussion?
That's right. That's right. And you say that we're working with a client right now. They happen to be a nonprofit, quite successful, with a very aggressive growth strategy. And they've asked us to look at the security and the technology and all how that would support it. And what we're finding is what you just said. They've always viewed technology as that, oh, that's just in the back office. When we need them, we'll ask them for, we'll call IT and whatever. And they're having to raise their game to where, again, in their case, again, it's a nonprofit board, but all the way from the board down, they're having to embrace this sense of, hey, we've got to look at technology as a strategic element in the organization, not as a tactical one.
Yeah, and there's another Forbes post that I did. The title is "Why CEOs Make the Perfect Corporate Board Members," and I think their view of the organization, and that used to be my client at the firm. And CIOs usually start a lot of conversations with, "What are we trying to achieve as a business?" So they don't start it from a technical perspective. In most cases, in my experience, they're very well grounded in terms of what the business is trying to achieve. They've got a phenomenal perspective across the totality of the business, and they also understand the technology stack and the architecture and the risks and the platforms that you're putting in place to enable those business outcomes. So I would take a CIO would be top of my list of probably any of the constituents that you would see typically in a corporate board, including a lot of CEOs.
Yeah, no, very, very definitely. So flip this chart to the other side. If 51% of CEOs list national and corporate cybersecurity as one of the top 3 global challenges, where are the other 49%?
Yeah, good question. That's why we have a crisis, Stan. That's why we're on the call.
Okay, so we're going to take this recording and we're going to send it out to all the other 49% of CEOs, 51% of boards, and investors seem to be even further behind.
Yeah, and there's arguably not arguably, there is a lot going on in the corporate boardroom. You see the Business Roundtable mandate that came out. 181 CEOs signed a declaration that stakeholders now are a focus, a priority. They'll consider stakeholders, although Delaware law is still fairly clear that shareholder primacy is the rule of the land for incorporated companies in Delaware. So that there's not a lot of teeth to that, but there has been a trend more towards a stakeholder mandate, and that's actually not new. Again, Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum was talking about a stakeholder theory of management in, I think it's 72 or 75. Drucker's talked about this, the organization's obligation to society and the markets that it performs in. So it's not a new concept, but we're getting off this quarterly hamster wheel that Wall Street has put companies in the United States on because it serves their interest. It creates more volatility. So I think that's a welcome addition, but also climate change, changing consumer preferences, the interactions of what's happening from a public, from a government perspective, from a democratic perspective, a democracy perspective, to the integration with private institutions and how that whole issue integrates. Some very, very foundational changes taking place, notwithstanding the core technology issues that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I see that is in some sense, and it gives my sense of what's the appropriate function of corporation goes all the way back to Adam Smith, and it's not about shareholder value. It's about doing good for, we all benefit from this miracle of capitalism, if you will. And it seems that what's happening, and tell me if you agree with this, that it's in some sense cybersecurity and technology and the changes we have to make there are just part and parcel of a whole set of changes now that are being, we the people, if you will, are pushing for, that need to happen.
Yes, and they're all codependent though. They're all very much more entwined than they ever have been before. So you can't leave one leg of the stool out of the discussion and out of the conversation. Just social media's impact on business, governments, the public conversation, and how that impacts organizations, and how social media is becoming this enormous threat vector for social engineering. And I actually wrote about that. I wrote a book in 2013 after I left the firm called Social Inc. that was foundational to these issues. And so you see technology permeating all these issues and conversations. So it has to be represented by the right skills and the right people in the boardroom at the leadership levels.
Right. So given that discussion we're having, and notwithstanding the fact that the number up in the upper left here is only 51%, you would still hope or expect or something that, okay, boards or corporations are beginning to get it, and we're getting more board members who understand these matters on boards. And yet this next chart, purposely skewed, I'll point out. I love it. When I first saw it, I wasn't sure. Did he drop this in wrong? Or
that was my artistic slant.
Right. Well, clearly something's slanted in the wrong direction, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It was a metaphor for how poorly skewed this issue towards the right answer. So if you look at corporate boards and how they structure as a proxy for whether governance is addressing this issue in a focused fashion, the numbers are fairly appalling. There are only 5 companies in the Dow 30 that have a tech committee, and it's 5 you wouldn't expect. It's Walmart, J&J, P&G, Amex, and I always forget the 5th one. But they're not the tech stalwarts. Walmart clearly got this issue because of the threat of Amazon, so they put a focused tech committee. And committees focus your effort. They signal that you're spending more time on this. They bring more efficiency, and they bring more skill alignment to issues. One of our core policy positions is every public company needs a tech and cybersecurity committee. I think that may be the nature of the regulatory response. Clearly, the data privacy committee that Facebook was forced to put in place indicates that regulators understand the importance of committee structures. But yeah, if you look at large companies and small companies, it doesn't really get much better across the Russell 3000 than it is at the Dow 30. And this is about getting the right skills on the board, organizing the board effectively, having the board put the right agenda in place to oversee and work with their management teams to deal with the insidious nature of these issues, both from a downside and an upside perspective.
You're right. Yeah, when I look at these numbers on the technology committee, as you go to the right from the Dow 30 to the S&P 500 to the Russell 3000, the percentages get worse.
Yeah.
And if there were just one Dow company with a cybersecurity committee, they'd also get worse going up on that channel, on the cybersecurity committee side as well, except that we've got this one. None of the Dow companies have a cybersecurity committee.
And you kind of, this opens up the conversation towards systemic risk as well. So you're only really as strong as the weakest partner in your supply chain. So we're working with some large organizations to start to look at that issue of systemic risk, and that's much different than ERM and what was put in place with Sarbanes-Oxley. But the contagion effect, the daisy chain, the domino effect of a risk starting with a small supply chain partner and then infiltrating and contaminating the entire supply chain, working its way upstream, as staging in the small company, then working your way upstream to the large organization, is a very real threat to big companies. And how do they control that? How do they control third parties that are integrated into their supply chain? Right now, they don't. But I think the big companies, as a proxy for regulation, I think you'll start to see regulatory type of of policies get put in place for them, for their partners to adhere to particular standards and to make sure that their supply chains are as secure as they are, because they're starting to recognize that they're only as strong as their weakest link.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, we're finding a lot of smaller companies coming to us, specifically around NIST 800-171 and the associated DFARS with that. That's coming from their customers,
Yeah.
the Boeings of the world, if you will, that are pushing down in the security into the supply chain. And one of the things I've always found very fascinating around California cybersecurity law is that, there's this general statement that every business in California needs to have an information security management program, and with CCPA that begins to take on a different life, if you will. The only thing in that law around what must a company do, it's got to have, quote, reasonable practices, and we had a whole webinar on what reasonable might count in a CCPA world, and SecureTheVillage has a minimum set of standards we believe to kind of as a floor on reasonableness. But the one thing the law includes is that a company must make sure that their third-party vendors also have a program, or that's explicit in the law. And again, I mean, when you look at these numbers, how bad they are, that leadership, that management from the top just isn't there.
Yeah, and there are multiple dimensions to this, and we'll talk about this on the next slides. But it's, there are skills on corporate boards, and then there's the organizing model for the board around these issues, so the committee structure, and then the right agenda to these issues. If you want to be a digitally savvy board, you kind of have to have all of those components, and it's not just one at the expense of others. It's not just putting a token cyber executive or technology executive on your board. The data is starting to show that you need critical mass to really drive these issues forward.
Yeah, same as in the community. I mean, if we're to make a difference, whether through the DDN or SecureTheVillage, just expanding the village, you get critical mass in the numbers that way as well. And,
exactly.
and that's part of the future that you and I are both committed to making that happen. So we're on that. But I think, and again, if you go to this next slide and the next two slides, both different aspects of the same message from MIT, but I find this compelling. It's like, well, okay, so if you're a board, why wouldn't you do this?
Yeah, and I was thrilled when they came out with this. We had nothing to do with it, but it perfectly supported our business case. It proved our case of DDN and why we started this. They cranked the data, and they looked at, if boards actually have the skills on the boards and are taking a more meaningful approach to this issue, does it have a business impact? And clearly it does. They came out with this only a couple of months ago, but 38% higher revenue growth for digitally savvy boards. Digitally savvy being defined as critical mass of 3 is the magic number on a corporate boardroom. 3 technology and cyber experts that get these issues. If you just have 1, nobody listens to them. If you just have 2, all they do is talk to each other. If you have 3, then you've probably organized more effectively in a committee structure, and you're starting to see the whole agenda permeate the entire oversight responsibility and board.
Yeah, because I see that in this slide, and then this one as well. This is the same thing. I mean, I guess with the magic number of 3, people can now talk to each other. Let's go do lunch, and this is the output.
And this is the money slide, right? So every CEO wakes up thinking about the next revenue dollar, and they wake up thinking about profitability. They don't wake up thinking intuitively through a risk lens. They think about markets. They think about the next revenue dollar and profitability. They don't intuitively approach these issues through a lens of risk, but that's really what it is. Back to the opportunity risk conversation that we had. What opportunities are you leaving by the wayside by not understanding the technologies that you have to change your value proposition? And what are your competitors doing better with these technologies that you're not? So it's very much a horse race.
Yeah, and that's the Walmart, Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. With a prize at the end. Here it is: 30% higher revenue growth and 70% higher profit margins. There's a clear prize at the end of this game.
Yeah.
as there always has been.
hmm Which now begs the question, which is the last slide. We'll spend a few minutes on this. Okay, given everything we've just said, what do we do? How do we truly make a difference?
Yeah, and it starts with understanding the problem, like any problem. So that's where we started DDN, where we've been evangelizing to these issues, raising the awareness, putting the data points out there so they become irrefutable. And any organization, large or small, can take steps to do that. Any CEO can take steps to do that themselves. So understanding and educating yourself on these problems is where step one is at. And then you start to get more tactical and understanding your risks, including your opportunity risks specific to your organization, your environment. And then once you kind of understand the risk landscape, what do you do with those risks?
hmm
Do you kill them? Do you accept them? Do you transfer them? Insurance, the cyber insurance industry is just exploding. But
hmm
buyer beware there. You have to look at the small print. You're seeing some of the was it the Petya attack? Once that was declared as a nation state attack, I think it was Zurich as the big underwriter said, okay, our policies don't pay on state sponsored attacks. So hundreds of millions of dollars of litigation. Companies that thought they were covered with a policy, all of a sudden
hmm
they're not. So you have to pay attention to that small print there. So you
Yeah.
can lay off these risks to others, but that doesn't change the fact that you have to understand them and you have other options in terms of
Yeah.
reducing them and eliminating them. And then all employees from the board on down, CEO, need to be educated and trained on these issues. I always ask the question when I talk to technology executives, CIOs, and CISOs, if they had one incremental dollar to spend, if all they had was $1 to spend on cyber prevention, where would they spend it? And they almost
hmm
all say employee education.
Yeah.
So it starts with every single one of your employees. Again, back to that weakest link theory. So
hmm
your suppliers are weak links, but your employees are the weakest link. So who's the
Right.
weakest link amongst your employee base? So they're out there. If you don't know
Yeah.
who they are, they're out there.
Yes.
And then know that the regulation, the accountability, the risks and costs are all increasing on these
Yeah.
issues. From government regulation to regulators in your supply chain holding you to higher standards of accountability on this issue. It's
hmm
not going away; it's getting worse, and the sticks and the penalties are going up. The stakes are going up.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, we see this, what you said about insurance. I think the worst policy I've ever read, and again, the devil is in the details on these things. I mean, the lawyers write these exclusions and definitions and all, and you got to be careful on what they read. I mean, and we've with everybody moving to the cloud, we've seen policies that don't cover cloud-based environments as one example.
Yeah,
But as I say, the worst I ever saw was a policy that would only cover a breach if all the systems were patched at the time of the breach. And come on, I have never seen a system where everything's patched. It doesn't happen.
yeah.
Uh, so it's definitely you got to read the fine print. And your point about educating and training employees as well. I was on the phone yesterday. With accounting firm talking to them about security, and the managing partner uh, said to me, well, our biggest concern is outsiders. We trust our employees and all. And I thought of this slide and I said to her, well, the challenge with your employees, whether you trust them or not, is they're susceptible to getting hacked. They're
Yeah,
the ones who are going to get those social engineering emails. And when they do, now the cyber criminal begins to look to your system as one of your employees. It's Bob, it's Fred, it's Sally, it's whoever, who isn't really one of those people, but the cyber criminal
yeah.
logging in as them, uh, and helping leadership understand this to me is always one of those major things that we have to do here.
Yeah, and it's not a singular thing. I think there's people think of cybersecurity as just one issue, technology is just another issue, but
Yeah.
there's this systemic complexity when you start to look at any emerging technology. You start to look at the data that you're starting to acquire through those emerging technologies, and there's many new data sources that companies are starting to collect because of spatial and temporal relevance, delivered through these type of devices,
Mhm.
data we've never had access to before. So what are you doing with that data?
Yeah.
And then you also get into architecture issues. So data, architecture, then the cybersecurity risk profile comes alongside of that. Then you have the operational side of how your technology team is implementing these issues. There's kind of this systemic daisy chain of very complex domains that comprise technology. It's not just one singular area. So when I have that
Mhm.
conversation with boards and leadership, they all go, okay, yeah, this isn't time for amateur hour. We need somebody that understands
Mhm.
the complexity of all of these domains. This isn't something that I'm ever going to get good at on my
Yeah.
own, although I can get better, and general directors and CEOs have a responsibility to get better at these issues themselves. But you need the people with the domain expertise that
Mhm.
understand this at depth.
Yeah, that I find just on the cybersecurity side, which is the part that I know best, um, just it's it is inherently a very complex subject, and as as the internet has grown and as this last 20 years, let's say, of technology development, it's become more complex.
Yeah,
Uh, it's nation states on the one side down to
yeah.
an independent person acting, as part of an ecosystem, but still acting independently, perhaps in a coffee shop in Nigeria or somewhere, or Los Angeles even. Yeah,
Yeah, it's complex, it's global, and it's real time.
yeah.
ERM, the Enterprise Risk Framework, wasn't designed with this level of systemic risk in mind. So
Mhm.
part of what DDN's doing with some leading companies is building out a new risk oversight framework,
Mhm.
focused on systemic risk oversight
Yeah.
and educating people to those issues.
hmm Yeah, yeah, and I love the concept of systemic risk, because
Yeah.
that's what we're looking at. We live in a world that is very complex, and this whole idea of systems thinking that uh, began to be popular 20 years ago or so. Things like
Well,
Peter
yeah, and
Sendi's The Fifth Discipline.
it really got
Yeah,
popular in '08 with the systemic
yeah,
risk of the financial meltdown. So you
yes,
started to see
also there.
financial institutions attempt to understand systemic risk, and it's very complicated because there are so many moving parts to it.
hmm
But that's the world we live in now. So
That's right.
you have to pay attention to it. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So a couple of final questions, just kind of to wrap up. To all right. So suppose that the chief executive doesn't have a board yet that understands these things. What's the chief executive's responsibility? Should he be pushing up to the board, waiting for the board? What's that look like in your sense, in your concept?
Well, if they don't have a board, they are the board.
Yeah,
So,
that's true. Yeah.
the oversight
Yeah.
responsibilities with the CEO, and back to kind of that blueprint of understanding the issues, starting to educate, and starting to put more structure to how you're overseeing these issues. CEOs, small cap CEOs are a lot hands-on than larger cap CEOs.
hmm
But still, that doesn't change the fact that they're responsible for these issues, and they're, whether you have your own board or not, there are third parties that can come in and help you
hmm
perform these functions. You can essentially outsource this to Stan. You do a lot of this work. Other firms do this work.
hmm
You can essentially get the right team around you to take a structured approach to this. It's just not something that um, uh, lends itself to just kind of a casual reactionary approach. It requires a proactive response. So if you're
Yeah.
a CEO without a board, you are the board.
That's right, and I like what you just said. It requires a proactive perspective
Yeah.
on this. You can't wait. You're always going to be playing catch up. Uh, it's hard not to be playing catch up, even being proactive, because the threat landscape is changing so quickly. Uh, but
Yeah,
if you're, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's smaller cap owned companies always, it's a priority of, where you spend money and yeah, and cyber risk, the downsides here are it's an insurance premium like anything else. And when risks go up, premiums go up. So
Hmm.
so your investment to lower your risk profile on these issues has a
Hmm.
business impact. Your
Hmm.
investment in understanding the upside of these technologies can help you find that next revenue dollar. So
Hmm.
if you look at the problem through both of those issues, the upside and the downside, I think it becomes easier to make more tactical investments
Hmm.
to improve your posture on both sides of the coin.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And
Yeah.
also a recognition that there's certain risks you cannot eliminate or transfer. Your brand is something that you can't, insurance can't, give you money that makes your brand whole again.
Yeah, and just basic business continuity. So ransomware.
Hmm.
The latest data I saw was over $1 billion had been spent out. I think this was a 2017 number, so I'm sure it's gone up dramatically since then. Over $1 billion had been spent in paying ransom.
Hmm.
Otherwise, your systems are going to be shut down. So business
Hmm.
continuity is kind of the ultimate end game for hackers. That's going to get the most attention and probably the the best payoff because you
Hmm.
can't transact. So I think we're going to start to see business continuity disruptions at scale, but
Hmm.
smaller cap companies are very ripe targets for business continuity. So what do you do when your data gets held hostage? The FBI used to advise that you pay the ransom.
Hmm.
There's very little else you could do. They've changed their official policy on that, but that's I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg on
Hmm.
ransomware. And what do you
Yeah,
do
yeah.
if you have that problem occur?
Exactly, and that's a good segue actually to discussion of our next webinar, October 3rd. We're going to be talking about the managing the security of the IT infrastructure, and that goes right to the question of readiness for a ransomware attack. How are your backups, and are they stored offline, and can you get them, and how quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So that'll be part of the discussion next month, October 3rd. Don't have a guest yet. We're still working on who I'll have to kind of help guide us through this. But that's the next webinar, October 3rd. It's part of our webinar series, the first Thursday of every month, and they're designed very much like this. We try to make them practical and real world. This is not an esoteric exercise, but something that's real here and now, right now. And they tie into the Secure the Village Information Security Resource Kit that we have on our website as well. And it's all part of what we're about. It's this growing community, using that community to educate the community, actionably educate, turning people and organizations into cyber guardians. That's what we look to do. One more shout out. Let me go back to this. Please register for the Secure the Village Pepperdine Cybersecure Southern California 2019. You can register for that at securethevillage.org. So get that, mark that on your calendars, register, plan to be there for that. Um, Here's contact information. I'll leave this up on the screen for a moment. Encourage everybody out there in the audience to check out the Digital Directors Network, digitaldirectors.network. Bob, your email is here. All my contact information is up there, of course. Final words, final thoughts that you've got?
Digital success starts at the top, and it starts with your leadership to everybody on the call. So be active, be proactive. This is an existential issue. So, and it's important to the sustainability of your business over time.
Good final words. I want to thank you. Another final slide with some more info, more URLs on it. Join with us. Follow us on LinkedIn. Look up our events. Come to an event. We have them regularly, particularly the Cybersecure Southern California. If you're involved in cybersecurity in any way, please consider joining the Leadership Council. Help us grow community, if you would. And if you want to sponsor any of this stuff, we're more than happy to help you get your your name out there as well as part of that. Bob, I'm grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us this morning about this. It's clearly something you and I are both passionate about. We've been working at it for several years, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Stan. Thanks everybody for dialing in, and I'm glad we're working on this together.
Yeah, me too. So thank you. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.